Like, I'm very curious to see what a pairing of Quinn Hughes and Filip Hronek will look like. But I just want to open it up to you because you watched a ton. You just wrote about it for The Athletic there. You didn't put him in your top 10 defensemen, though, Filip Hronek, but you did spend a lot of time watching him. I found it interesting that you immediately, kind of off the top of the article, addressed the questions about if Hronek has some defensive warts and what he looks like as a one-on-one defender. Looked like from the way you wrote about it and kind of play some video in there, like you were somewhat impressed, I would say, from his one-on-one defending ability.
For sure.
Which is, by the way, it's funny because I could bring up the shot, I could bring up him moving the puck, but the first thing I wanted to talk about, and the first thing you mentioned in the article, was his defending. I'm curious why you went that direction.
Because it was the most surprising part, right? Sort of, I just mentioned the idea that it takes a while to shed reputations and labels. The story around Hronek, the way he was described for a really long time, was offensive defender who has significant defensive warts. And don't get me wrong, that reputation earlier in his career was earned, right? He was logging these huge minutes for the Red Wings on some bad rebuilding teams. He was a defensive liability at times, right? On the ice for way more goals against than he was goals for, showing up the same way in terms of the shots and scoring chances against. But he's had a breakout year this season, and watching him play, and in my process, I try to be very meticulous about, okay, if I'm watching games here, I want to make sure that I don't just like watch 5 games in a row, like in a stretch of like March, right? I made sure that I watched games that were like, watched a game in October, one in November, one from like 2 weeks ago, interspersed it throughout the calendar year, so I wouldn't be caught in like, ooh, he's having a 5-game heater playing the best hockey, or like he's having a 5-game drought. And I also looked at the individual game logs of trying to find games where it's like, he had an excellent game by the underlying metrics. Let's see what that looks like. He had a really rough game by the underlying metrics. Let's look at that. He had some average games. Let's look at that. And the thing that consistently stood out was he was totally fine defensively. Like, he was pretty competent there. Definitely a significant step up from what I've noticed in terms of his defensive awareness, how he's constantly scanning, checking, shoulder checking, looking to take away the cross-seam pass. He took it away on a number of occasions. And don't get me wrong, I don't think he's the second coming of Chris Tanev or anything. There were definitely instances where I watched him and went, okay, like I can see there's work to be done there. Like, he's not the most agile defender off the rush, which will be interesting to see, but he's extremely competitive, right? Like, he's average size, but the one thing I noticed is when he's able to play, like when he has a tight gap, right? He's really aggressive on closing and hounding the puck carrier and using a combination of a stick and body to be able to create that change in possession, to be able to break that play up. And I saw him do that. Some of the clips I highlighted were against Boldy, Kaprizov, Stamkos. Yeah. Like, he was doing it against some legit competition, even though generally speaking this year, he's mostly played traditional second pair matchups, which I think is part of the story as well, is that he's had this breakout now that he's played in a second pair role behind Seider instead of being leaned on as the number one. But yeah, he was solid in that regard. He very rarely did I see him make a bad read and put himself way out of position. He just seemed like a solid all around 2A defenseman, which is, I guess, the biggest takeaway was he's not this sort of offense. He's not this offensive D with defensive warts.